A group of scientists on a research trip to the North Pole thought they were completely alone on that frozen stretch of land. But they got the shock of their lives when they came across about a dozen frozen figures. At first glance, they thought they were statues, but when they looked closer, they realized they weren't statues at all. What they found ended up making headlines around the globe. Even with all the photos the team took, most people had a hard time believing what they were seeing. The whole story sounded too wild, like something out of a bad conspiracy theory. But the evidence was right there for everyone to see. Only after news crews went to the exact coordinates and saw the strange figures for themselves did people finally start to accept the truth. Maybe the world didn't know everything about the North Pole after all. Like most scientific trips, the instructions for this one were simple and clear. But this wasn't your average expedition. Every trip has its surprises. But this one? This was something completely different. No one could have expected what they were about to uncover. And once it got out, it was all over the news. What they stumbled upon wasn't just strange. It was unlike anything anyone had seen before. Things felt off from the moment they stepped into the base. It could have just been the cold or the never-ending wind, but something didn't feel right. There was this heavy feeling in the air, like something was about to go wrong. And eventually, it did. The scientists were there for a regular mission, monitoring the melting ice caps, which needed constant observation. They took their work seriously, and they cared about what they were doing, which made what happened next even more surprising. When the scientists arrived, something was already off. They were eager to begin their work and take over for the team before them. But when they got to the base, it was empty. The team they were supposed to relieve had already gone. That wasn't supposed to happen. Someone was always meant to be on site. What had made them leave so suddenly? It was unsettling. They tried to get in touch with their contacts to figure out what had happened, but the bad weather made communication nearly impossible. No one gave them a clear answer about where the first team had gone. Had they left early because of a storm? Or something else? Even worse, did they ever make it home? The new team didn't know what to think, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Despite all the weirdness, the next 2 weeks went mostly as expected. The weather stayed rough, and trying to contact anyone became even harder. But that strange, uneasy feeling still lingered. The team couldn't stop wondering about the people who came before them. Were they okay? Were they in danger? Was this place even safe? Then something happened. One night, a scientist noticed something strange coming through the radio. He quickly woke the others and asked the radio to repeat the message. The 4 of them were groggy and half asleep, but once they heard what was being said, they were fully alert. It was a distress call. The signal was weak and kept breaking up, but the voice asking for help was clear enough to send a chill down their spines. The person on the radio kept repeating the same set of coordinates. The scientists quickly scribbled them down and kept trying to get the person to respond, but the weather was getting worse by the minute. Then the signal suddenly cut out. Just gone. The team stood there unsure what to do. As far as they knew, they were the only ones at this base, and no nearby stations were supposed to be active. It was bitterly cold this time of year and pitch dark most of the day. Being here was dangerous, and they'd only come with special government approval. So who else could possibly be out there? They couldn't ignore it. This was a distress call. Someone was out there and needed help. And from the sound of it, maybe more than one person. The location that had been repeated wasn't too far from where they were. It was still a real hike, but doable. They didn't really have a choice. They had to go. Normally, it would take a few hours to walk there, but with the storm, they guessed it would take most of a day. Not easy, but not impossible either. Still, they wondered, could the people who needed help survive that long? Or would they be too late? The spot on the map was in a direction they'd never gone before. It was close, sure, but not part of their study area. They usually stuck to a specific route, and this was outside of it. That meant they technically needed clearance to head out that way. But with the storm knocking out their radio, they couldn't reach anyone to ask for permission. Every time they tried to call out, there was just silence. They were wasting time. The choice was clear. They had to go now, with or without approval. There wasn't even any argument about it. Everyone agreed. If someone needed help, they had to go. They packed quickly. Leaving wasn't ideal, especially since they'd have to pause their study. But they had no choice. They got everything ready to leave the base unmanned for a few days, taking only the gear they absolutely needed. Still, they couldn't head out until morning. They hated waiting, but it was the only way to stay safe. If they wanted to save anyone, they couldn't afford to take risks. That would get them killed too. Even after all their prep, the environment was rough and unpredictable. As soon as they started the journey, the weather somehow got even worse. Wind, snow, freezing cold. They could barely see a few feet ahead. They kept going, but it was slow. By the time they were close to the coordinates, everyone was drained. And worse, they hadn't seen a single sign of anyone. That was worrying. The plan had been to find people and bring them back to the base, but now things were getting harder by the hour. Everyone was running on empty. They considered stopping to rest. It would have been the smart thing to do. But then they remembered the voice on the radio. They couldn't leave anyone out here to suffer, not if they were close. So they pushed up one last icy hill toward the spot on the map. It had been a long, exhausting trek. They were cold, tired, and full of questions. The whole way there, they kept asking the same thing. How could anyone else even be out here? They couldn't stop thinking about it. How could something like this be out here, and how did no one in charge know about it? The group figured maybe they'd spot a crashed plane or a helicopter, something to explain how people could have gotten here. Maybe whoever needed help had just arrived. But there was no wreckage, no vehicle of any kind. Instead, what they found was something completely different, and honestly, bizarre. No one could make sense of what they were seeing. The storm had calmed just enough that they could see something unusual through the snow and ice. At first, they thought their eyes were playing tricks on them. But no, it really looked like an old house surrounded by a short stone wall. There were even bare trees, like someone had once kept a garden there. What in the world was this place? And that wasn't even the strangest part. All around the garden stood figures. They looked human. Too human? Could these be the people who sent the distress call? Had they frozen out here? The sight was chilling. Something terrible had happened here. But how? And how was any of this real? The scientists didn't have answers, but they knew they had to get closer. If those really were people, they needed to find out for sure. Most of the team didn't say a word. They were stunned, unsure what to think or do. Still, they moved forward. The house, the trees, the frozen figures. It didn't make sense. If these were the people from the call, then things were even worse than they'd imagined. The team moved as fast as they could, pushing through the snow in their heavy gear. The storm had settled a bit, but the cold and terrain were still rough. Nothing added up, but they weren't turning back now. They picked one of the figures and rushed toward it. One of the scientists removed their protective goggles to get a clearer look. What they saw made their stomach turn. The figures weren't people. They were statues, frozen in place. So was most of what they'd seen in the garden. But that didn't explain anything. If these weren't real people, then who sent the call? And why was all this here? The group moved further in, hoping for more clues. Off in the distance, they spotted something that looked like a hut. As they got closer, they realized it was an old, weathered lodge. It didn't look like part of the house. It was separate, but nearby. What could that mean? Was it safe to approach? After some back and forth, they agreed to knock. There was no response. They grouped back up and carefully moved toward the door. One of the scientists reached out and gently tried the knob. To everyone's surprise, it turned. The door was unlocked. That didn't make sense. No one should have been able to survive out here, not in a place this remote, not without serious support. They stepped inside. What they found was even stranger than everything else. The lodge was in decent shape, everything was intact, and nothing looked abandoned or broken. Even the kitchen had food in the cupboards, nothing spoiled either. It looked like someone had been there recently. Could the person who sent the distress call have been living here all along? After checking every room and making sure the place was empty, the scientists decided they needed to rest. They stripped off their outer gear and agreed to spend the night inside. They were exhausted and needed to regain their strength. And besides, if someone really lived here, they might come back. It made sense to wait. Evening came quickly, and it didn't take long before everyone picked a spot to lie down. Most of them fell asleep right away, completely worn out from the hike. Everyone except for one, Matthew. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't fall asleep. His mind kept drifting back to those statues. Everything they'd seen that day had been strange, but those statues, there was something deeply unsettling about them. He couldn't shake it. Something about the whole thing felt off, and he wasn't sure they were safe here. Matthew kept thinking there had to be some logical explanation for how those objects ended up out here, but with no one around to give answers, it was driving him crazy. Frustrated and restless, he stood up suddenly. Sleep wasn't happening anyway. He walked over to the single window in the lodge and peeked out. To his surprise, the storm had completely cleared. Before he could talk himself out of it, he was already slipping his boots back on and heading for the door. Something was pulling him back to those strange statues. He felt like he'd missed something the first time. Matthew stepped outside quietly, careful not to wake the others. The cold hit him hard, but with the storm gone and the full moon overhead, visibility was much better through his snow goggles. He walked straight to one of the figures, brushed off more snow, and began a close inspection. He pulled out his magnifying glass and checked the statue carefully, starting from the base and moving slowly upward. After a few minutes of examining it, he figured they were likely made of some kind of stone or possibly metal. But that changed once he looked the figure in the eyes. Matthew's own eyes widened. Suddenly, things that hadn't made sense before started clicking into place. He took a step back, heart racing, and shouted toward the house for anyone awake to come outside. It was urgent. He thought he could hear voices stirring inside the lodge as he waited. While standing there, he quickly pulled out his camera and began snapping photos. If what he'd seen was real, he'd need proof. No one would believe him otherwise. Just then, one of the other scientists, a woman from the team, came outside. She quietly closed the door behind her and started walking toward him through the snow. But before she could make it all the way, she suddenly froze, right in the middle of the path. She seemed stuck, unable to move her legs. Her arm lifted shakily, and she pointed directly at Matthew. Confused, he called out to her, but she didn't respond. That's when he noticed something strange. She wasn't pointing at him. She was pointing past him. Matthew spun around quickly, and the moment he saw what was behind him, he understood her reaction. His stomach dropped, but at the same time, a strange sense of relief came over him. This had to be what the distress call was about. It explained everything. But now, there was fear. They had to leave. Fast. About 3 months had passed since that night. The scientists had made it back home safely, and things had slowly started to return to normal, on the outside at least. After finally making it back to their base, they'd called the project supervisor and requested an immediate pickup. A flight was arranged, and the team was flown out as soon as possible. Since the week they returned, the team had been doing everything they could to share what happened out there. But even with all of Matthew's photos, hardly anyone believed their story. The team reached out to news outlets, trying for days to get someone to take it seriously. Most just brushed them off. In the end, only one small station showed any real interest. Even then, the station wasn't ready to publish anything without solid proof. So after some discussion, their team made a decision. They would send people to the coordinates and see the mystery for themselves. It was a surprising turn of events. The team of researchers finally felt some relief. At least one organization had taken them seriously. The news station wasted no time and pulled together an expedition of their own to verify the claims. And sure enough, they found exactly what the scientists had described. When that team returned about 2 weeks later, the station moved quickly. They prepared to publish the full story, including a detailed introduction from the research team, their original mission, and a special focus on Matthew's role in the discovery. Just 3 days after their return, the article was live, and the world was stunned. It turned out the North Pole wasn't as empty as most people had believed. Deep in that frozen region, a group of criminals had been using the land to hide stolen goods. Over the years, they'd built a secret storage site in the middle of nowhere. It had worked perfectly, until now. With help from an international law enforcement team, the area was fully investigated. What they found was shocking. Dozens of stolen items, including a large number of statues taken from private collections over the years. Many were made of gold. It seemed the criminals had used the remote garden as a hidden storage area, planning to sell the items when the time was right. Near the site, investigators also found a jetty and a cargo boat, likely used to move the stolen goods in and out without drawing attention. Surprisingly, it didn't take long to locate the people behind the operation. Most of the suspects were arrested even before the article went public. While they faced trial, a second team of experts began working on identifying the rightful owners of each statue. This unexpected discovery made headlines everywhere. Suddenly, people around the world were talking about the North Pole, not just for its climate or remoteness, but for this hidden criminal network. If you found this story as surprising as we did, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more real stories just like this one. Your support helps us bring these incredible discoveries to light.